Hi there, I'm Kevin Gentry, and welcome to the Going Big podcast, where we'll explore some of the strategies that can help you transform your effectiveness by 10xing your fundraising. Each week, we'll sit down with some of the most influential business leaders, CEOs, and nonprofit visionaries to talk about leadership, the power of giving, and how you can make a real impact. If you want to make a transformational change to the cause you're working on, this is the place for that conversation. Also, take a look at our website, 10xstrategies.com. That's TENX strategies.com for lots of free marketing and fundraising resources. And be sure to sign up for the free weekly fundraising tips. Now, let's dive in. Well, it's great to be with the Reverend Sam Ferguson, rector of the Falls Church Anglican in Northern Virginia. Sam, let's just go big right from the start. Given the season, for the benefit of our listeners, what is Advent, what is Christmas, and who is Jesus Christ?
Well, Kevin, thank you for having me. And those are the big questions, at least the questions that are on my mind as a pastor here coming into Advent. So Advent is just a word that means coming or arrival. And it's a word that the church used over the centuries to talk about Jesus coming. And Advent refers, when we talk about Advent leading up to Christmas, it talks about Jesus' first coming when he came as a baby with Mary and Joseph, and then grew up and died on the cross for our sins. But Advent also, in the Christian worldview, speaks to Jesus' second coming, which will be at the end of history when he comes back. And so that's also one of the things Advent means. And Christmas centers around the advent or coming of Jesus this first time. And one of the real shocks of Christmas that it can be lost on, even a minister like me, is in the Christian worldview, Jesus' coming is the long hoped for arrival of God, where God will deal with the evil in the world and the sin and brokenness in us. And this happens in the third decade of the first century. This is when Jesus was born. And you would kind of expect, if God's going to show up and fight evil in a world where the Roman Empire is expanding, Caesar Augustus is welcoming that people will worship him. In some cases, Rome is really conquering and dominating people. Herod the Great, a client king at the time, has issued an edict where all the male boys that are recently born to Hebrew women will be killed because he's worried about a coming Messiah. You would expect that God's coming would be with an army to fight the bad guys and push back evil. And he would come as a king in the way you might anticipate, thinking of Babylon or Syria or Persia or Greece or Rome. And a king would come and conquer with an army. And it would be very clear that he would rule through power, a type of power that could look like coercion sometimes, with a sword. Or you can think of Louis XIV with rolling cannons out. So what's shocking about Christmas is that God's arrival is in the cry of a baby, a helpless little baby in a young woman's arms. And this is his way of defeating evil. And as Christians have reflected on this, they've realized it's because he came in grace. And God found a way to uphold both justice, where his son would grow up and die on the cross for our sins, and also mercy, where Jesus coming would say to the world, you can run to me, you can come to me. I mean, who is afraid of a baby? It's one of the most approachable things on earth. So that's what I'm thinking about. That's a long answer to your question, but when I think about Advent and Christmas, I'm thinking of the fact that when God came to fight evil, he came as a baby. And there's a deep mystery and beauty in that.
Wow, thank you. Well, what part of the Christmas story is most meaningful to you? And if I could ask, what do you think, what part of it is most relevant to the world in 2024?
Yeah. I think, kind of attached to what I said before, I think one of the things that's the most meaningful is the coming of God into the world um, tells me that God is pursuing me. So I'll just speak personally right now. The movement is not ultimately me towards God. In other words, my hope doesn't rest in whether or not I can get to God, but in the fact that God has come to me. And Paul talks about this movement of God coming to us in Philippians 2, where he talks about Jesus not counting equality with God a thing to be grasped, but laying aside his glory, taking on the form of a servant, right? Appearing in human form as a servant and becoming obedient to the point of death. And it tells me that God's after me, not in the form of coming with anger, but he's pursuing me to save me. So Christmas speaks of movement from God towards me, and that's a great relief. Um, and I think in 2024, um, you know, I would say that one of the most relevant things about the Christmas story is that God wants to say to the world that he's approachable. Coming as a baby rather than a king with a sword drawn in his first advent says he's approachable. And, you can think, I did an internship once at a huge pharmaceutical company. And, sat in a sea of cubicles, and many people listening to this can picture that. Maybe that's kind of your work environment. And every now and then somebody brings their baby and they're out on maternity leave, maybe, or paternity leave, and they bring the baby in. And when a baby's walked around in the sea of cubicles, everybody's reaction is, "Oh my goodness!" And there's something so approachable about a baby and a person with a baby. And so I just think one of the things God is communicating to us at Christmas, to everybody who may think, well, God certainly wouldn't want to talk to me, look at my lifestyle or look at the mistakes I've made, is he's approachable. And he says, "Come to me." Jesus will go on when he grows up to say, "Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So he wants you to come to him. He's approachable. That's the thing I think would be really relevant in 2024.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A few episodes ago, I interviewed Jim Shepard and Mark Dillon from the Generis firm, and we discussed a biblical basis for giving. What do you believe is God's call to us about giving, especially this time of the year?
Yeah. God does not in the church. So those of us who have come to know God through Christ, our lives are based on grace, and the the Greek word that we translate as grace, charis, um, it literally means gift. And so the whole Christian life centers around God's gift to us. It's his gift of his own son. It's the gift of eternal life. It's the gift of acceptance and eternal love from him. It's the gift of his presence in our lives. And as I've tried to let that impact and change my life, I found that the Christian call to give is really a response and an overflow of what God has given to us. And it's interesting that, again, not to get overly bookish, but when the Latin translators translate the Bible from Greek to Latin, the word they use to translate grace, gratias, I'm probably not going to pronounce it right, but it's the root of the word gratitude. So you could just think grace creates gratitude, and gratitude, gratefulness to God, overflows, I think, in wanting to give back to the things that are dear to God's heart. And I think everything from supporting the work of the church to wanting to give in such a way that lifts up people that don't have enough food or enough clothing, pleases God's heart. And I think giving sometimes needs to be practiced as a discipline. That's what I've had to do in my own life. And I've always been shocked when I actually do it. It brings joy. It's very counterintuitive, but Jesus said it is better to give than to receive. And when I've practiced that, I used this image with our church here a few weeks ago. I was thinking through how I would want to tithe in 2025, and even as a pastor, I feel like I want to hoard my resources. That's the reaction of my heart. It's expensive, life's expensive. You need all this, and I took some time to kind of pray through this. I just set aside about 30 minutes to think and pray. And as I felt like, no, Lord, I want to give this way this year. And it's nothing extravagant. I have a long way to go. But the image I used with the church was, it felt like I was walking back into my Heavenly Father's house, where when I walked back inside, he said, Sam, remember that all that I have is yours. This is all yours. I'm going to share what I have with you. I take care of you. Whereas when I was hoarding, it was like Sam living on his own out in the world, and I've got to have my own back, and it's just my pocketbook, and that's it. And when I thought about tithing, I just felt like the Lord was like, "Why don't you come back inside, where everything that I have is yours?" And that was it's kind of like walking into Narnia, like in the C.S. Lewis novel. So anyway, that's how I've been thinking about it, Kevin.
Nice, very nice. Well, I've heard you tell a story about when you were growing up, I think in high school or maybe graduating, and a friend of yours got a certain gift, and then you got a gift from your parents, and the contrast of it and how you felt then, and then maybe how you feel today. Could you share that?
Yeah. So a lot of you will relate to this listening. One of the things that happens senior year coming up to graduation is a lot of parents or families get the graduates gifts. And in my senior year, one of my closest friends, have been friends since second grade, he got a red Ford Mustang, and you just can't beat that as a kid. And my parents got me a Bible, and it had my initials in it. My dad had written a note in it, but it just paled in comparison. However, I took that Bible to college, and I can actually remember a few nights in college, literally, where I was feeling torn between kind of a certain kind of party lifestyle and my own spiritual heritage of sitting and reading that Bible at my desk. And in one way or another, I mean, I could reach over my desk right now and grab that Bible. I mean, I've become a pastor. I got a dozen Bibles sitting around, but that Bible has been on my desk or close to my desk since then, one way or another. And I thought what my parents were trying to give me was a relationship with God. And that's something that they can't ultimately give me. That has to come between God and me. But I look back now, years and years later, and you can imagine, as I graduated from high school in 2001, a Mustang from 2001 now. I mean, you'd be like, give me a break. And what that Bible represents to me, it's a gift that's value just continues to grow, even though I wasn't mature enough, um, I was too steeped in immediate gratification to appreciate the gift at the time. You can just imagine now which one looks more valuable to me, and that's been interesting and really neat to reflect on.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing it. Well, this is the Going Big podcast. We think about going big in a transformational way, about solving big problems, thinking about things in a big way. How can giving change our lives?
Yeah, I think. I mean, that's a good question, and it's a good question because it feels counterintuitive. It's like, how can having less of something I think I need, like money or time, add to my life positively or change my life rather than taking away from it? And I think there's probably a lot of ways it changes us that are positive. A few that come to mind would be one. Um, I think for a Christian, giving um, begins to draw you back into a reality that's always true, which is of your dependence on God. And it's always better for your sense of peace and for your decision making to be leaning on God rather than walking independently of God. And giving, particularly when you give big, because if you give big, it hurts, right? There's an element where you're like, wow, if I decide to tithe 10% kind of pre-tax this year, whoa. And you start to think, what else could I do with that money? Um, and you're thinking, well, I'm going to have to depend on God for those other things. I have heard so many stories of people who say how God just shows up. Um, and what that does is it begins to teach your heart experientially that God's real. So it makes dependence on God experiential because it's like you actually need to lean on Him, you know? Um, I think uh, giving attaches you in your heart to things outside of yourself in a way that's emotionally connective. So, for example, if a family were to say, this year we want to give to a school, an international school, we want to support a student. Next thing you know, they've got a picture of that student hanging on their refrigerator, and they're connected now to another human being. And that's impactful. They're invested in a school apart from the school their own children go to. And I think those things are impactful. You start to give to your local church, you start to think more deeply about what the church teaches, about their children's programming. And so it cultivates I think a healthy attachment um, to other things beyond your immediate attachments. And I just think that's a form of maturing and growth. Um, and I think it changes us as a person. The last thing I'll say is I do think I've experienced this in my own life, and I'll just say this has always been a challenge for me. I remember being taught to tithe in my house growing up, and then 3 or 4 years of college going by, and I was working these part-time jobs and realizing I've never tithed the whole time I've been in college, and having a moment where I tried to add up what I had made and plan to tithe on it and how hard that was. So this has always been hard for me. But I do think when you start to tithe, it's kind of like it starts to teach your heart to dream a little bit more, to believe in miracle. And it's kind of like a farmer who's like, well, when I stopped hoarding all my seeds and started sowing them, I started dreaming about a big harvest. And so I think the more we sow into God's kingdom, the more we're going to start to dream about the things He's doing. And that's been my experience. I remember when I decided towards the end of college that I was like, I need to go back and tithe. And there were these two missionaries I had met from Korea. I was in Philadelphia, and they'd come over to do missions to students in Philadelphia. They had evangelized me right on the street and were discipling me. And I thought about, I want to tithe, like I want to give and support their work. It just changed the way I started thinking about the work of missionaries. Um, and because I became a farmer in that field. And so those are just a few ways I think you think it's going to shrink you and it ends up enlarging you. Um, anyway, yeah, those are some
That's
thoughts.
yeah, no, that's terrific. And we know from the Bible the Lord loves a cheerful giver.
It does.
And as Jim Shepherd shared earlier, that is it a generous gift? Is it maybe a significant gift, or is it a sacrificial gift? And that's a really generous gift. You're saying a lot of terrific stuff. Well, switching gears just a little bit, our society today is even more secular, increasingly secular. Church attendance continues to drop, broadly speaking. You lead a very large church in Northern Virginia. How do you think the church today reaches people? I know you have a broad range from very mature believers to seekers or very new converts. There are a lot of immigrants who come into Northern Virginia, and they may not come from the same faith background, a Christian faith background. They may come to the Christian faith. How do you think the church reaches people in our modern society?
That's a really good question too, Kevin. And I certainly don't have an exhaustive answer, but um, a few thoughts. One is I remind myself a lot um, that God is at work in the world, calling people to Himself. You see this in the Bible a lot, and I remind myself that the Lord is out there drawing people to himself. In other words, it's not ultimately just what I do, and that gives me more confidence. Um, a little more practically, I think there's a way to think about kind of drawing people, or at least getting them interested in the church. There's ways to think about it collectively as the church is gathered, and there's ways to think about it as we're scattered in our individual lives. And I think when I think about as we're gathered on a Sunday morning, I think about creating a church experience that is very friendly. So I always think the sermon begins in the parking garage for us. Did somebody um, did they feel like as they left the parking garage and walked in, they were greeted by someone who said, "Hey, head right that way," and that happens at our church. So I think a very welcoming, hospitable place is important. I think. And again, I'm assuming here that you have a visitor coming, or one of our church members has brought a friend from work. And so I'm thinking, what is their experience going to be like? So I think warm and welcoming church. Um, I think beauty and meaning are attractive. And there's a beauty to a community of people that are from very different backgrounds and aren't kin, right? They're not biologically related, but who really seem to love each other and sing and worship the Lord and have beautiful worship. There's something about that that actually doesn't really happen anywhere else. I mean, people go to like a Taylor Swift concert or a U2 concert, or a sporting event, but by and large, this is very unique. Human beings assembling together to sing is very unusual. Um, and that's something I want to catch people's eye and say, wow, they're cheerful, they're happy. I think in preaching to try to speak in a way that's clear and touches on felt needs that an average person would have, inviting people back to church. So I think the collective gathering, we need to think about it as missional. And one of the phrases I've heard people use is it's a compelling community. There's something compelling about the experience of it. And then just to encourage your folks at your church, hey, bring a friend. And one of the things we do is we have at our church what I think are very easy on-ramp Sundays. So we do Handel's Messiah during Advent. And I always say, hey, if you have friends that like music, this is going to be one part of Handel's Messiah. I'll give a little sermon, 8 minutes. We have lessons in carols. This is just examples from Advent where we're going to sing people's favorite hymns. And I say, hey, invite a friend here. I think the other areas of helping, in an increasingly non-Christian culture, people meet Jesus is going to be very relational in our individual lives. And over time, um, people need to notice something a little different about us if we're Christians. In Russian literature, there's a character, a type called the Holy Fool. And for listeners who, back in college or whatever, had to make their way through Brothers Karamazov, this would be Alyosha, the younger of three brothers. Alyosha is studying to be a monk in a monastery, and there's family problems, and he has to leave the monastery. And he's very innocent, very godly, and he goes out in the world. And a lot of times he seems like a fool because he's so godly. How he treats women, how he looks at money. He gets walked on, taken advantage of, because there's almost a naivete in him. And yet people find him so attractive because there's no guile in him, there's no pretense. And I've always found in that character, like, there's something compelling about a holy person, even when they know they might get made fun of a little bit, but they are kind and warm. They're humble, but that doesn't mean they're weak. They're not operating out of a spirit of fear. But I think there's a quality to the Christian life that could be described as holiness that glows over time, and I think it's peculiar. I think it's going to look foolish. Like if somebody at your job said, wait, you give 10% of your income away every year to a church? That's so foolish. They might say that, they might not. Oh, you spent half of your vacation doing a mission trip, but they might after a while say, wow, that's very unique. So I think our lifestyle over time needs to be something that has a quality to it that is attractive. And at some point, then we need to actually, I think, intentionally, over a couple coffees, say to a friend, "Hey, would you ever want to read one of these old accounts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth with me?" Mark is only 16 chapters. Um, I mean, I'd just love to read it with you. It'd be a lot of fun. Would you want to do that? And just ask. And I think there's more people who'd be willing to do that than we realize. And I think that takes the individual Christian has to cross the pain point, right? Um, when you just do acts of service in your community, you don't really cross a pain point, except maybe using your time and money. When you ask a friend or a colleague if they'd like to read the Gospel of Mark, you cross a different pain point. And I think a lot of Christians don't want to cross that pain point. It's like, as a former basketball coach, teaching a player to use his left hand. It's like, I know you can shoot a right-handed layup. I want you to go to your left. And that's an area I think we need to boldly say, Lord Jesus, in the next 2 years, who am I going to invite to read the Gospel of Mark with me that doesn't know you? And just see what happens.
That's awesome. Well, I know you've been really encouraging that kind of behavior. I'm going to try to get the nerve to do that this year. Sam, I'd like even you to expand a little bit more. You've written a lot and preached a lot about the relational, the importance of being relational. The Falls Church Anglican, for which you're the rector and have been for a number of years, is a very prominent and influential church in the Washington, D.C. area, and it has a big impact for the kingdom. How do you balance that? You've been already talking about how you're balancing all these different things. How do you balance that calling, we'll say, with also the need to reach out to the local community right there in Falls Church, Virginia? How do you how do you address that?
Yeah. I don't think I've done a good job of that. I'll just start with, um, the analogy I use sometimes to myself is if a couple's newly married and getting married coincides with them buying a new house in a new neighborhood. And if for the first 2 years, they're not doing a great job serving their neighbors because they're trying to figure out how to be married, that's okay. And so there's a season I felt, I've been at Falls Church 5 years where I felt like I'm learning how to be married to this church. I'm learning how to care for us. I'm learning how to run. We have plus 50 plus people on staff here. I'm learning how to run a staff, a vestry, a budget. Um, and that's just taken a lot of internal focus. But it has always been on my heart to say, okay, Lord, I want to be out in the community. And so I think sometimes there's a danger in saying things I say this to myself that are just remain too abstract. You want to be in the community. It's like, of course, everybody would say that. It's like saying you want to share the love of God with people. Yeah, of course. When I get what I do in my own head and try to be a little more concrete, is I think say things like, okay, um, I ought to get to know or meet the fire chief and the police chief that are closest to my church building this year. I hear the ambulance go by. I hear police sirens. I hear the fire truck. It's just the nature of you're in a building multiple days of the week. And so what do these groups represent? They represent servants to this local community who serve every type of person, right? Fires aren't respecters of person, so rich, poor. Um, and I say to myself, well, if I got to know them, or at least went to meet with them and said, hey, I pastor this church, you probably have driven by it. I'm wondering if there's any way we could serve you this year. And it could be as simple as, would you okay if we just prayed through your list of firefighters regularly by name, that the Lord God would protect them? Or another thing I think about, and I'm saying all these things, I better do them now, but the other thing I think about is getting to know the local principals and saying, hey, we've got a church with 2,000 members. I bet you I could get you 50 volunteers without trying very hard. If I did that, what would you want them to throw their energy into in a way that creates no work for you at all? And it might be, would they do a baked goods sale to raise money so that kids who can't afford graduation gowns could get them this year, or help with funds for field trips for underprivileged kids? Those are things that when I think get out into the community, I think this would be concrete, and it would be a way where our approach to the community is one of service rather than showing up and be like, well, hey, we look around, we've decided you have these 10 problems and here's how we're going to solve them. It starts more by listening. And I think these are things that not just a church, but individuals can do, families can do over the course of a year. They could say, hey, let's draw, a circle around our house, a 2.5 mile radius, or maybe a 1 mile radius, and let's just pick two things this year that we're going to pray for. But they're going to be things where we go and we meet the people leading them. And our only question is, hey, how could we help out this year? So those are some things that cross my mind. But Kevin, honestly, and folks out there who are running a small business or running a church can relate. It's easy to say these things. It's hard to create the time to do them, and that's a challenge for me. Is looking at my schedule and blocking out times to go out in the community and befriend people.
Thank you. All right. Well, a few more questions before we wrap up. And you just mentioned challenges. Technology. The iPhone is nearly ubiquitous today. There are lots of wonderful, amazing opportunities that come to us all from continued innovations in technology. But there are a lot of challenges and a lot of risks, and I expect you see that firsthand. What do you tell, for example, parents of young children today, or any thoughts on, let's just say, social media in particular?
Yeah, the research on the impact of social media on young people is often pretty negative. Uh, its effect on anxiety would be one example. And a lot of people are writing on this now. Jonathan Haidt would be one. He just put out a book, I think, called The Age of Anxiety. And so I haven't announced this from the pulpit. I haven't been overly prescriptive from the pulpit, but in one-on-one scenarios or in small classroom settings, um, I say things like, your kids shouldn't have a smartphone anytime before high school, and if they don't absolutely need it in high school, figure out a way for them not to have it, but definitely not in middle school. But again, I don't say this. Every family is different. These are one of these things where you may be able to figure out a way to do it. So I don't mean to be overly prescriptive. Um, it's the same thing with giving, right? Giving, right, Kevin? You don't say to people, if you don't give this amount, God doesn't love you. So I don't want to be heavy-handed. Um, I think with social media, I would, I don't have any social media. And one of the reasons I'm thankful for that is because, I don't feel the pressure to write an op-ed every evening. Something bad happens in the world. And I think a lot of pastors do. And that's a lot of pressure. Um, and so I think I would encourage parents, and I do encourage parents, to keep their kids off social media for as long as they can. I think it's very hard to do. I know a lot of stories where one family won't give their kid a smartphone, they won't have them on social media, but that young teenager has a friend and they have a social media account on their friend's phone. So I think it's tough. I certainly think inside the home, there needs to be a level of control over screen time. And that may mean no screens go upstairs or into the bedroom. We have a little basket we put them in. Or it could be there's an app for all this stuff, but you can control how much time the computer's on, right? Okay, you've got your 30 minutes now. I think that's really important. I was sitting right here. I don't know if you can see this. This is called a light phone, Light. It's a dumb phone. You can text and you can make calls. I've never used it. I literally got it a few days ago. And I'm planning on trying to work out in my own life. Is there at least one 24-hour period where key people in my life would have this number? But I don't have my phone with me, my smartphone. I leave it at the office. Because, I'll be, even if you know you shouldn't be on email because you're taking a break, it's very hard not to check email. And so yeah. And then you're like, well, I've got my music on my phone, and you end up reaching for it, and next thing you know, you've got an email, and there goes the next 2 hours. So I'm good. I haven't tried that yet, but I've been thinking a lot about this personally, and I think parents could get their kids what they call dumb phones. Say, hey, if you need to call 911, if you need to call home, you can, but you don't need to be on Instagram, while you walk around school right now.
Nice. Thank you. Sam, how did you come into the ministry? Okay, I'll give away that. My wife and I have, of course, been a part of the Falls Church for a long time. Our kids were baptized, raised there. You're a very important part of our lives. The church certainly is a very important part of our life. So I know you didn't always think about the ministry, but tell us about how you came into the ministry.
Yeah. It was very unexpected. In brief, I grew up in a Christian home, but I didn't have a whole lot of interest in Christianity, all the way till heading off to college. And that wasn't because I didn't believe it. It just, that it's like the penny didn't drop. The light switch hadn't gone on, and it just didn't matter a whole lot to my heart. And then about two-thirds of the way through college, um, several things happened. The death of a very close friend, um, relationship with a young lady not going well, a little broken heart in there. And then also, I think vocationally, I'd worked at a pharmaceutical company. I worked up at IBM for an internship, and I was able to do this while I was in college. And that afforded me a different way to start to think through my own gifts. And so all those things were converging in a way that I think I was turning to God. Death, heartbreak, and then the question of meaning and vocation. That's a nice little recipe for at least wondering if there's a being out there who might want to help you through these things. And so I started, like, right around when I was turning 21, I started really, really crying out to God on my own. And My mom had gotten me Purpose Driven Life by Rick Warren one Christmas before. And then I had the Bible that I'd been given high school graduation. And I'd always, every morning of my life, almost every morning when I was growing up, I'd come downstairs, and either I'd see my dad doing his quiet time, or I'd see where he had done it, because I always sat at the counter and I knew that was his Bible, notepad, and pen. And and so part of it was like, oh, I kind of have a wagon track for this already. You read the Bible and you pray with God. And I started to do that. And it was like God just swept me up in his arms, like he had been coming after me. And it was like the light switch went on. And so the first thing that happened was, very quickly I became all absorbed. Like, oh my goodness, if this is true, it changes how I look at my friends, it changes how I live, it changes how I think about what I'm going to do with my life. And I felt, honestly, it was a really hard season in one way, because I felt very odd at college all of a sudden, like a religious fanatic. And I'd met these two missionaries from Korea, and they led me through a 40-day Bible study. Here I'm meeting with these two missionaries. I don't want my friends to see me because they're like, this looks weird. Um, and in the midst of all that, and this is the strange part, it was like the Lord somehow just communicated deep in my soul, like, you're going to be all in. Um, and you're not going to fit anything else in. Like, you are going to be a minister for me, and you're going to be a pastor. So it's kind of like my conversion, or my awakening for me personally, was like a call to be a pastor. And I didn't even know what seminary was. And so then I tried to do a church plant in inner city Philly. My last year of college, first year out, with a couple guys. We called it the Philly Church Plant. Ended up meeting at a rescue mission in North Philly on Tuesday nights, and ended up being a huge outreach to kids. And then I ended up being a high school basketball coach in Philadelphia Public League, and was all inner city work. And I thought, this is where the Lord wants me to minister. And then during that time, I had some really good mentors say, you're not sustainable what you're trying to do. You don't know anything. You think you're going to plant a church, um, you need to go get some training. And then anyway, led to going to seminary and everything like that. But it very much was like, within a couple month period of an awakening in faith, it just felt like you're a pastor. And, and honestly, it just has been the most enthralling, thrilling, wonderful, hard thing. The Lord's answer to the big prayer for me was I said, I want to have a meaningful life. I want to have a meaningful vocation. And it was like, be careful what you ask for. And he has answered that. And not a lot of people I know have this blessing, but the Lord has given it to me, and I don't know why. But the integration between vocation and identity and passion for me is so tight that it's just a real, I'm thankful. I would do what I do for free. Um, anyway, that's kind of how it came about. And I was 21, 22, and then by the time I went to seminary, I was 25. So worked in the inner city doing ministry, and then went off to seminary, and yeah, ended up at the Lord brought me to Falls Church, a great church where I learned how to pastor under John Yates. And then that church called me to be the rector. And so I'm very honored.
Well, we are all blessed by the path that the Lord has chosen for you and that you've taken. Sam, what is it like to be a pastor today, especially young pastor? I know you must be in touch with others. Or just give us a perspective on that. You will always put on a great, positive, brave face, but what's it like?
Yeah. I'll preface my answer with saying, I only know the experience I've had. So I don't know what it was like to be a pastor in 1776, right? In Washington. So there have been other hard times or during the Black Plague, but I think it's hard. I have a lot of peers who are quitting. And I think one of the reasons is I do think we're living through a time. One is because of technology, how connected we are. People are very divided. And um, you feel a pressure to weigh in on incredibly complex situations that many people treat in an overly simplistic way, like immigration or race in America, patriotism, nationalism, an epidemic like COVID-19, your view on the efficacy of wearing a mask. And the truth of it is, I just want you to know your pastor doesn't know anything about this stuff. Okay? I mean, maybe a little bit, but if they've been trained to read church history, a little Greek and Hebrew, some theology. They've been trained in homiletics, a little bit of pastoral, a little bit of counseling, but how to do citizenship vis-a-vis a multiple thousand-mile border is such a complicated um, dilemma that when you have people say, well, if you say this, you're a racist. If you don't say this, you're a racist. It's incredibly hard. And then silence is commenting. So that has been excruciating. And you feel like you need to prove your morality all the time. So, oh, well, I'm so glad you weighed in. Now I know you care. And it's like, well, could you just give me the benefit of the doubt? Like maybe I'm not a jerk. Maybe I'm not a closet racist. Um, maybe I'm not a white supremacist, but I mean, it's been incredibly psychologically hard. And I think these issues are important. I think pastors need to be able to courageously lead in them. And I certainly haven't always done a sufficient job. Um, but I feel like sometimes, and look, our church is in Metro Washington, D.C., right? So it's intense. But I feel like sometimes I want to tell people, you didn't hire me to write 2 opinion columns a week in the Washington Post. And if you would have offered me that job, I wouldn't have even been interviewed for it. But the local minister, our field of practice is morality. And so anything that feels like it touches on morality, we can kind of think we should be an expert in. Um, but the truth is, a lot of these issues aren't about morality. People are moral on both sides of them. They're about the complexity of huge, large-scale social interventions that are hard to measure the efficacy of their outcome. And it's not moral. It's sometimes just people have different means to achieve the same desired ends. And so that's been really hard. Um, I think people aren't doing great. I think there's a lot of mental illness in younger people, and that's challenging. Um, but man, I tell you what, the Lord, does he ever leverage weakness and challenge? I mean, he loves it. It's like you want your minister feeling a little bit weak all the time because that seems to be how the Lord likes to work. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for the gospel right now. And um, but yeah, it's I hear from a lot of people. I'm blessed. I think we have a great church, and I'm really well loved by our church. Um, but I think the level of conflict in the background and the level of situations where the pastors just don't have any idea what to say or do, but are kind of condemned if they do say something or if they don't, it's hard. And I don't want to sound like a wimp, it's okay for things to be hard. But anyway, that's been a challenge for my peers and myself.
Well, you are indeed loved by our church. And ladies and gentlemen who might be listening, if you want to find out more, you can check out the Falls Church Anglican online, tfcanglican.org. A lot of Sam's past sermons, and you can check into future sermons as well. Sam, close us out. Let's go back to the theme of Christmas. What would you leave us with to really encourage us? And what would you recommend? I know you don't like to recommend and be prescriptive, but encourage us in a way by giving us something that you think we should do as we approach this Christmas season and head into the new year as well.
Yeah. I would just leave you with the big idea of gift, that grace is gift. And so Christmas, obviously, you're buying gifts for people, et cetera, et cetera. But that the great image in our church is when we have communion, when we go forward, people come forward with your, if you're watching this, with empty hands. They have nothing. They bring nothing. And we put the bread in their hands, and then they take some wine. And I always think what that represents is God wants to give you himself. He wants to give you God, that he is your portion. And it takes a while sometimes to cultivate a taste for God because our spiritual taste buds are dull. But just know that there's a lot of blessings you're praying for this Christmas, and I hope the Lord blesses your socks off. But the gift is him, and ask him to help you receive him into your life more and more. And the little prescriptive practice would be, I would challenge you this Advent to serve. And that could be as simple, and that's a great way to actually get out of a cul-de-sac of pain, is to get out a little 3x5 or 5x7 note card or a yellow sticky note and just write down the name. If you're a student, or if you're a parent, one or two people that you want to serve in the next few weeks. And you could do that by praying for them. You could do that, say, I'm going to send them an encouraging text once a week, or I'm going to buy them a gift. But what you want to do is you want to think on them and pray for them regularly. So you keep the little sticky note in your wallet and just watch what happens to your heart. You go from being sometimes like a stagnant pool to a spring that's flowing just by saying, you know what? Who am I? I'm that guy that serves Bobby this week. That's who I am. I'm not, I'm thinking about Bobby or Sally. So that would be the little prescriptive, exciting experiment to do this Advent is pick somebody to serve and serve their socks off.
That's a great way to close this out. God bless you, Sam Ferguson. Thank you for being with us today, and all the continued best to you.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me. This has been a joy to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to today's Going Big podcast. Hopefully you were inspired to go big for your cause. Remember, this is all about transforming your effectiveness by 10xing your fundraising. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe or leave us a review. at iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also catch this episode on YouTube. And also, there are lots of resources available to you at my website, which is 10xstrategies.com. That's TENXstrategies.com. You can sign up also for our free weekly fundraising tips. This is all about helping you get to the root causes of some of the biggest problems in society today by transforming your fundraising and your effectiveness. Thanks again. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.